How gruesome really were the Dark Ages. The Romans had many enemies, but nobody was ready for the power vacuum that manifested when the German chieftain broke their Western Empire, even though the collapse of the empire was long overdue. As they were the hegemon of the European world, the effects were felt all around, and Europe was plunged into the period known as the Dark Ages. Can you imagine what it must have been like living in that world? In a world where an empire that had ruled and persevered for centuries was so easily toppled in days? You might have an idea, but in this video, we're going to help guide your imagination. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's start by telling you a story. It's a story that has been told and retold, a story that played out in the Dark Ages in different cities and states across the centuries more than 100 times. It is a story of power, corruption, and tyranny, the inclination of the mighty to exert their dominance over the powerless. In today's world, there are many checks and balances to the might of the elite. Wealthy corporations are subject to the policies of governments that preside over where they operate. Those governments are subject to the will of the people they rule over, and the people are, in turn, ruled by the government, balancing everything out. This wasn't so in the Dark Ages. Back then, the people were ruled by a network of oligarchs who either came into power through the hereditary advantage of being born into a powerful family, through appointment, or through the establishment by the sovereign after coming into favor with the sovereign. They usually held their positions for life, no matter how incompetent or corrupt they were. Why is this relevant? Since the pervasive system of government was feudalism, the sovereign themselves were usually only established by hereditary rule, and they usually held the position for life. Since they had no one to check their powers, they could do whatever they wanted and enact whatever policies they thought were necessary. This frequently led to the erosion of economies, public service, and justice. A government is largely a reflection of its people. If the system of power was this prone to corruption, how do you think regular people lived their lives? In peace and harmony? Love, pride, and patriotism? No, these virtues definitely were not lacking in amount, but things were driven more primally than one would expect. Now that we are sensitized to that, we're going to run you through the most pervasive parts of the Dark Ages that defined the era. This isn't going to give you a definitive judgment of what those times were like. After all, it isn't any much different from what some of us might already be seeing in present times. There's a lot to cover. We would be as quick, but as insightful as possible. Stick with us for a little longer as we examine just how gruesome the Dark Ages were. In the Dark Ages, it was normal for governments to experience rebels and other non-state actors parading around their kingdoms and making life unbearable for citizens. Robbers, zealots, and other similar groups were able to easily band together and form hierarchical organizations that would develop complex creeds and platforms to terrorize citizens. As you can imagine, this would have made the life of a peasant very unpleasant. These groups only could do this because the governments were not as efficient. Some of them even were able to establish tax levies on regular people. Not only were there irregularities in the government, but justice was also scarce as well. If your government has no incentive to serve you, there's no way the justice system would be designed to give you a fair chance. Rules went along the lines of thieves shall lose an arm and rapists shall be gelded. Methods of extracting information from captives during the war included torture of the very worst kind. Needless to say, these practices were barbaric and never to be sacralized. Imagine getting on the wrong side of someone more powerful than you in society. The person sets up a sham trial for you, and you are sentenced to death by some sort of deranged fantasy that the executioners have designed to draw out your pain. Poor sap. If you probably lived in today's era, the death penalty would not have been your lot. Moving out of the premise of government and established institutions, it almost seemed nature was against those who lived in those times. We have heaters now to make things very cozy in bad weather and air conditioners designed to cool people down in hot weather. The folks in the Dark Ages didn't have these. They had to get by using warm clothing and architecture to protect themselves. Imagine how things would have been for the homeless or people who had just recently survived an invasion. Back then, bad weather was fatal. It could kill people caught out, it could damage crops, and it could break homes. Luckily for us, things are different now. We can now go as far as preemptively making preparations for the weather. And like most eras in the past, the medical practice was nothing to write home about. Think Game of Thrones. At least the Order of the Maesters had a centralized system where they recorded the things they did to cure people of diseases, and still that pales in comparison with what we have. It's not the case for the Dark Ages though. When people had a fever, they had to contend with medicine men telling them to sprinkle the wings of dead insects in their food as medicine. A lot of people eventually died, and these medicine men still had customers who took them seriously. It doesn't help that the Dark Ages was a period of little enlightenment, and religion was probably the only stable institution in the lives of the people. It doesn't take much to imagine how bad medicine was in those days. With poor medical practice, infants born then didn't stand a chance. If you met the average 40-year-old woman in the Dark Ages, they would have given birth to quite a few children who didn't survive infancy at all. Parents now have the resources to take care of their children appropriately and allow them to grow into strong, healthy adults. Back then, it was very common for children to die from various diseases and other similar outside factors. Imagine being a parent at their age and how catastrophic the job was to keep your kids from being statistics while not having access to the resources to do so. It's not like they were rich enough to buy enough food either. The experience must have been so painful. Did you want to go to a new country or state? You were opening yourself to new dangers, to the likes of which you had never encountered. After all, that's what most fantasy adventure movies are all about. It was as natural as breathing to encounter people who wanted to rob you every time you decided to travel. Since you were definitely going to be on the road for days, you needed a good and safe place to sleep too. Except you reached a new village and lodged in an inn before nightfall. You had to camp in the open. It's not an experience I would wish on anyone, and it led to deaths more often than not. If you decided to travel by sea, storms could shipwreck you just as easily as you'd kick a pebble on the road. Things were very dicey. Face it, you live in a period of peace and stability that is nothing like the Dark Ages. Right now, various countries have complex diplomatic missions to establish relationships with other countries. In those times though, diplomacy was basically, thou shalt be eliminated if thou art weak. As we said earlier, the fall of the Roman Empire opened a vacuum. Other countries tried to take advantage of this vacuum by invading each other and setting themselves as the dominant power in the process. The lower class people were made to fight wars and defend themselves from invaders. Not exactly a nice way to live life, but I suppose it was adventurous enough for them. How about the danger and violence? Interpersonal violence was more prevalent in the Dark Ages than it is today. This includes vices like murder, arson, rape, etc. It has been established that in those days, homicide rates were projected to be at least 10 times what they are today. In addition to this, the justice system was not well equipped to deal with pop-ups of such scenarios. The combination of these meant that older adults were a rarity, even in settlements where people were largely pacifists. If you weren't being killed by invaders or dying in wars, you were dying of an open wound or something as small as a fever. A simple allergy could take you, or a neighbor that wanted your partner for themselves could do you in and get away with it. The elite in society frequently exerted their power over the small folk, and nothing could be done about it. All things perfect now? Debatable. All things better now? Definitely. Existence back then was catastrophic, and I, for one, wouldn't wish it on anybody.